Let's now talk about traditional Dena'ina culture, and in doing so, I think the readings have already done a far better job than I could have. One of the sets of readings you did was by Peter Kalifornsky, an extremely well-known Dena'ina author who had seen significant amounts of historical change within Dena'ina society, and who writes, I think, very evocatively about pre-colonial Dena'ina traditions and teachings as he understood them, and as he spoke about them. And you then have a reading by the other reading about Dena'ina's religious beliefs that I think also does a very good job of talking about sort of especially pre-colonial Dena'ina traditional beliefs and how this changed under colonialism. And so I think they do a better job than I am going to do here, but I did want to kind of reiterate a few points about traditional Dena'ina culture as well as add a few points of my own. Now, traditional has an asterisk next to it, and there's a good reason why. Because we kind of need to clarify what we mean by traditional Dena'ina culture. Traditional is, a lot of times we'll use that term within anthropology to clarify the difference between, or to acknowledge the fact that cultures change over time. And so what a culture looks like in 2020 may not be exactly what it looks like in, for example, 1600. But it can also sometimes refer to the fact that there are elements of a cultural tradition that have existed for a very long time, even if they are still around in 2020. Today, what we're going to be talking about is more of the former than the latter, although some of both. So it's mainly going to be, when I use the word traditional here, it's mainly going to mean historical, things that happened either prior to European colonialism / Russian colonialism and or early on in the colonial period, sort of in the 1800s. Although sometimes I'll also mean things that are still happening today. For the most part, I'm talking about historical practices. We should recognize, though, that cultures are always changing and contested, so what was traditional changed over time, and who gets to decide what's traditional, obviously, is contested. So, the traditional Dena'ina culture, though, culture as it existed prior to European colonialism, was heavily impacted by colonialism in several different ways. During the Russian period, there was, of course, violence and sometimes assaults by Russian fur traders. There was the market economy, so even when the association was nonviolent and sometimes voluntary between Dena'ina people and Russian people, there was obviously, it's different to introduce a bunch of new types of goods into a society, and then for that society that would be essentially trapping furs to then trade with you for those goods, so it's sort of bringing them into a market or capitalist economy, which obviously has its effects, whether good or bad. There was also the smallpox epidemic of the early 1800s, which decimated 50% of the Dena'ina population. And then, sort of in the wake of that, conversion of many Dena'ina people to Russian Orthodoxy, which is a specific form of Christianity. So huge effects during the Russian era. Not to mention then the purchase of Russia by the United States and the colonialism period of that time period, which in many cases meant sort of settlements and expanded homesteading, heavy hunting presence. It also meant things like cannery work, as the canneries were established on the peninsula, so Dena'ina people going to work again in kind of a market economy, and how that shifts things away from a traditional subsistence village-based only economy, and now sort of more of a mix of wage labor and subsistence model. And then, of course, since the 1970s, we've had INCSA and the corporate model, with many people, Dena'ina people, having both village-level corporations and a lot of say in some of the regional corporations. And so these kind of three different phases or periods of colonialism and historic change have obviously had their effect on what we're going to be talking about today. So a lot of what we're going to talk about is reconstructions, and they're of traditional Dena'ina culture, and they're based on talking to elders who have that understanding. They're based partly on things that are still ongoing. They're based partly on sudku, as Boraas and Dena'ina Peter said, sort of traditional stories such as those told by Kalifornsky and others. There's a lot of different sources, and there's archaeology, of course, as well that we use, and Alan Boraas, who did that reading, has done quite a bit of the archaeology for this specific area for Dena'ina people down here on the peninsula, especially around Kenai River. But there is plenty more to be done in the future. But all of these different sources of information give us a sense, an imperfect sense, but a sense of some of the things that are going on historically in Dena'ina culture. And one of the things that we get, and I liked the reading that you did because it really emphasized that, is we get the sense that within traditional Dena'ina society, the social world and the ecological world were intimately connected. The natural world and the social world were intimately connected. Whereas we sometimes divide humans and natures very strongly sometimes in our modern culture, such as when we talk about natural resources or when we, put up a no trespassing sort of sign around a park. In the Dena'ina worldview, these things traditionally were extremely connected in part because there was sort of a continual cycle of reincarnation of animals, of prey species coming back to the humans, so long as the Dena'ina people properly followed certain rituals of respect and relationships of respect. So the goal was to perfectly replicate, as Boraas and Peter point out, and by the way, I should say Alan Boraas was an anthropologist, the late Alan Boraas from KPC, and Dena'ina Peter is a Dena'ina leader and scholar. And so anyways, they both talk about this idea of a perfect replication of past worlds. The idea was that if you kept the culture going and followed the practices that had been handed down and followed the rituals of respect and the religious practices like Kech, that you would then successfully cause there to be a society now that looked like the society of your parents, that looked like the society of your grandparents, and on and on and on. And not only that, but that there'd be continual cycles of the animals coming back and back and back and back, generation after generation. So sort of a continual recreation of the world with time almost cyclical, not exactly cyclical, but sort of a continual revolution of life with societies hopefully replicating what came before them, but also this theme of sort of the animals again returning again and again. So this sort of ongoing cycle of returns was maintained in part by the practices of that you read about by the Kech Eltanen, these spiritual specialists, but they were also kind of more generally this social, natural, ecological system was maintained by the respectful actions of everyone. Whether or not you were Kech Eltanen, Dena'ina hunters had a responsibility to honor their prey species, properly dispose of the bodies so that they wouldn't be mangled in the afterlife, and otherwise relate to the world in a proper way so that the world, both natural and social, could continue to replicate itself, continually to recreate itself after each generation. So as they talk about in the reading, Kech Eltanen is a term that can be translated into English as true believer, as somebody that is on a spiritual quest to gain, Kech Eltanen, to gain true belief. The idea is that these people are people who come to understand the world through a spiritual lens, not just the lens of what is immediately observable, and they come to understand that the world is full of agentive action by both seen and unseen beings, which sounds really fancy, but let me clarify what I mean. The world as a place where the thoughts and actions of human beings have consequences and affect the natural world, and how the natural world is also full of beings who have thoughts and actions which affect us, but it's a world that things don't just happen for no reason. Instead, they're caused by the thoughts, attitudes, and actions of beings, particularly of human beings. And so this is kind of a key tenet in some of this early Dena'ina philosophy or traditional Dena'ina philosophy, this idea of belief, and that belief in the spiritual world causes one to have certain kinds of attitudes of respect and of following correct, proper protocols of respect, which then manifests in certain kinds of actions, somebody that takes the right rituals, and that then causes the world to keep going the way it's supposed to keep going. So belief to attitude to action. By the way, I intentionally chose a lot of black and white photos, many of them from historical photos. Not all of them, I don't think, but most of them, for the purpose of sort of making this seem more historical, because we are talking about that traditional cultural practices. So, in the Boraas and Peter reading then, they talk about this idea of Kech Eltanen and this idea of sort of recreating the world in a good, proper way over and over. But that was helped greatly by not just everybody in the village showing respect to the natural world, but also specifically by specific practitioners. And the reading talks about several, such as Gashak, which may or may not... Oops, I forgot one. I apologize. Gashak, which may or may not be synonymous with shaman. You also have Kalifornsky in his ratings identified these several different characteristics: the dreamers, the Kutsitsekan, the sky readers, people who could interpret things such as when the solstice was going to be, and what the different times of this year were, and things having to do with prey species. You had the doctors, or Eltanen. These are glottal stops, these little apostrophes. So kind of like if you've ever said the word British like a British person, right? British. A glottal stop is where you kind of pause the pronunciation for a minute. So Eltanen. A doctor, somebody who could heal maladies in that way through physical medicines. You had prophets, Benaga, Dena'ina, and then you had shamans. And what I thought was interesting about these spiritual specialists, among other things, is that several of them, such as dreamers, sky readers, and prophets, have the ability to foretell hidden information, what we would call from an anthropological perspective, divination, and the ability specifically to tell certain kinds of hidden information, such as what the different times of the year were, so part of the role of the sky reader to sort of determine when the solstice is and mark the passing of time, to tell when prey species were going to decline, to tell things about people's illnesses. And so I think when we look at this and we look at what were these specialists, so they were finding hidden information. Many cultures have ways of finding hidden information. And it is also often interesting to see what the cultures consider to be important hidden information. For example, among the Azande in Central Africa, traditionally, important information included whether or not your sickness was the result of a witch and who was the witch responsible. Within ancient Israelite society, some of the important hidden information included how God was going to deal with the Israelite nation in the future, which is part of what the Old Testament prophets would prophesy about. So within traditional Dena'ina society, you had these future tellers who were focused, among other things, on prey species, health, and the different seasonal cycles, which, among other things, emphasizes the very, very utter importance of sacred ecology, of these relationships with prey species, with animal species, and the importance of survival and physical well-being and health within this system of thinking. You also have the idea of dreams as a powerful way of telling the future, or rather of telling something that will occur, and not just as sort of a random set of coincidences. In the reading, they also talked about the idea of certain rituals that were associated with these systems of belief, including ways that animal remains were to be disposed of. So both in the reading by Kalfornsky and the reading by Boraas and Peter, they talk about the fact that they talk about Dena'ina stories where people, for example, the one about the young man who was improperly disposing of the animal bones, sort of trampling on them and throwing them out and things. And as a result, animals in this world, in the place where they go after they die, animal bodies were all mangled and they couldn't be reincarnated, which means they couldn't come back to be prey species again and be hunted again by human beings, a significant loss for the group. And so you have this idea of animal reincarnation or revisitations of animals being sent back if they've been properly cared for, but their bodies have to be properly cared for that to happen. So they need to be in a good condition when they go to the place where animals go so that they can be ready for more animals or those same animals to be sent back to the humans. In this regard, hunting is sort of an agentive action in the sense that the prey species have some say in the matter, or rather, the spiritual beings that control the prey species do, or to some degree, so long as they're respected, they come back. But it's still a degree to which you have sort of agency and sentience, at least being hinted at. So there are proper rituals to respect these animals. There was, for many of the animal bones, burning by fire, cremation practices. You had water where you would return the bones of some of the prey to water. So certain kinds of species got, instead of burned, thrown back into the water. And this is important in the sense of that it shows us kind of what we could call a sacred ecology, a way of viewing nature as a sacred relationship with other beings that have to be respected in certain ways. When you understand animal species, and I think probably a lot of hunters of many cultural traditions feel this way up here in Alaska, but when you start to understand animals as beings, this affects how you're supposed to relate to them, including how you dispose of the dead. They are not just a thing to be thrown about. I'll briefly mention also that they talked about the water ritual of drinking 3 sips of water and reflecting. So we see again this theme of water as a purifying force, as a powerful force within Dena'ina society traditionally. And indeed, in another writing Boraas suggests that you can see the Dena'ina emphasis on the power and sacredness of water in terms of how they practice their Russian Orthodoxy. So there's a type of Russian Orthodox ceremony that blesses water to become holy water, and he talks about sort of the emphasis of that ritual within Dena'ina, specific Dena'ina Orthodox communities. They also talk about in that reading the idea of different phases of time. They talk about what he's calling mythic time. He doesn't mean that it's literally not real. I know that's sometimes what a myth can mean. As anthropologists, when we say mythic or mythological, we mean just sacred story, or like very old story. So there's kind of the mythic time, the time the animals could talk. So there's a time period where you have sentient animals, such as that can speak and communicate with human beings, such as the trickster raven. You then have human time, or what's sometimes called the coming of the campfire people, so sort of stories that have to do with what has happened since the Dena'ina people settled in the peninsula, if you're here on the peninsula, or settled in whatever area they're in, if you're in other areas such as Anchorage. And then you have the third time period of sort of after the white man came, which Boraas calls historic time. So 3 fundamental different divisions of time.